Before we get started, can I just get a show of hands? How many people in the room are like audio folk and more focused on the sound side of things? Okay, strap in because this originally was a programming talk. All right, so this is Every Tree in the Forest. My things are here. So, important note, the slides are online at the bottom, link at the bottom of the screen as the example source code for the demo. So who am I and why should you listen to me? A senior gameplay programmer at Gameloft. I am queer, I'm trans, I'm incredibly autistic, and I'm about to rant at you about something which I really like. So that's going to be fun. Here is a non-exhaustive list of the things that I've done. It gets across the point that I've been doing this for a little while, but you'll notice that vessel has been highlighted because that's going to be very relevant to this talk. And what you should be expecting from this talk is, first of all, like most of my talks, this thing is going to be a full onslaught of information. Don't feel like you need to keep up with every single detail. You're really just trying to get the high level because my intention is I'm dropping almost everything I know about this subject on you so that you can learn it faster than I did. This talk itself is like almost an index or a introduction, and then you've got the slides, the recordings, source code to essentially refer to this if you need to use it yourself later. Also, this talk was a bit rough. The time constraints on preparing it were pretty wild, so I apologize if there's anything that's a little bit difficult to understand. So let's get started. I'm just going to do this way. So what we're trying to solve here is basically that volumetric audio is hard. And specifically, it's something where volumetric audio is kind of got a very easily defined name, but how we use it and when things are actually volumetric, in my opinion, is a little bit weird. It's basically whenever we've got like lots of sounds, we want to either have an area that we want to be playing sound from as opposed to a single point, or we've got many things in an area where they're playing sounds and we kind of want them to be almost do part of the same sound from our perspective. So some examples are liquid simulations where every single drop of the water or grid cell is technically something that could make sound. You've got ambience from dense foliage where it's like the ambience should be making sound when you get close to individual trees, or you've got large numbers of impacts where the normal way to do that is just to cut the number of maximum voices so you only hear a couple, but then you don't actually hear how much of an impact really just happened. And we can't just play more sounds, both because of CPU costs and other resources. It also just sounds shit because that you get a destructive interference whenever you put two nearly identical sounds over each other at the same time. You play enough sounds, it's going to happen at some point, so you can't just play more to get out of the situation. So we generally either have bespoke systems or hand-placed ambience, or a fallback is just, hey, we'll just drop the maximum voice count and hope for the best. Those aren't bad solutions, but we can do better. What would be nice, and this is like this isn't a massive relevation or anything, we just want to use one sound to represent multiple sounds, but we want to do it dynamically. We essentially can take sounds and give them parameters that change what that sound sounds like while it's going and playing, using either encode ourselves or in middleware with like fmod or wise, and basically give it a parameter that says, this is now 3 trees or 1 tree, and you can blend it between these things, and the sound will blend between different variants or different effects to do so. A good example of this is if you were playing bullet effects from a minigun, if you just played every single bullet hit over each other, you'd get that destructive interference, it'd sound terrible. If you actually just play from a sound from the point where it's currently hitting mostly, and you say, okay, this is 30 bullets per second, that sounds way better. And we want to do that, but we want to do that broadly for environmental audio, moving objects, everything. And there's this cool theory behind this, which we're going to completely bounce off, because this is a huge field of biology and psychology called audio stream segregation. And it's basically, when do we notice sounds when do we group sounds in our brains, or when do we notice, that's a different sound? The short version is it comes down to different factors. Things like, is this thing changing? Is it moving, or something about it, has it changed? Because we notice that really well. There's the direction of the sound, like is it coming from somewhere else? Is it at a different volume or pitch? And then we've also got focus of attention. If I'm really paying attention to that thing, I'll be able to discern it from others. And then there's personal differences, like I have very strong sound sensitivities, and if a child were to scream anywhere within this convention center, I would know about it. So huge area of research, massive iceberg. We're basically just going to pay attention to the fact that those factors exist and move right along. So moving on to the next bit, which was actually 15 years ago. So let's talk about Vessel. Back in 2009, I worked on Vessel, and like all the games at the time, it was a 2D puzzle platformer with a unique mechanic. In its case, it was liquid physics. Actually, can you see that okay? Should I maximize it? All right. So, water simulation sounds. The game actually is about liquid-based creatures and physics puzzles and things like that, but I did not want to spend a good 2 minutes of my talk just showing you a trailer. So this ran on a custom C++ engine. We used Fmod for sound, and one of my first tasks working on it was to find a way to play reactive sounds for all that stuff. So different types of liquid sounds. We had 3 different types of liquid sounds in Vessel. We had collision, which was when water hit a hard surface. We had rushing, which was when water moved around in large groups or was under pressure. It was kind of like liquid hits liquid as a sound. That came from like when the water particles were under pressure. And then there's fusion, which is like any time when 2 liquids touched each other and had a reaction that turned them into a different thing. So Vessel had like water and lava and steam. Steam's technically a liquid in Vessel. And having them 2 touch would be an event which would cause like steam to be created from those 2. And so we approached this basically the same as that concept before. We just wanted to use shared sounds for lots of events. So we stored those events in the positions they happened at as points. We'd remove these points after a certain amount of time. You could update the position of a point if it was like, this is water moving under pressure, it just, the event follows that point, or a collision just happens where it happens. And then we group those events by proximity, and we play a sound representing them along with audio parameters about what just happened at that average location. And so that looked a bit like this. This is an old version of Fmod Studio, and these are various parameters. Actually, let me turn the volume on. So we had like speed, drop count, etc. And you see these circles? Those are these sort of areas in which like points are being collected. And then you can see like the little things showing all of their parameters, and the little speakers were which ones were currently playing sounds, because 2009 we could only afford to have so many voices active. Working with a 5% CPU budget was fun. Yeah, so basically the main part was that drop count parameter. How many drops are in this sound would drastically change how much. Is it a single drop? Is it like tons of water? And then each of these sounds also had unique ones, like the rushing one had pressure and density, or pressure and density are the same thing, but then also speed and others. So like a bit of a multivariable thing. So that's the basic idea. Let's just name this thing and move on to how it works, because we've got a better system or a different system. This one's actually still useful for certain cases. The new one will be more general purpose. So I'm going to call this world space clustering. And basically what world space clustering is good for is sounds in 2D games. It's really quite, like in Vessel, it worked perfectly well for what we needed. It's also good for short impact sounds even in 3D games. It's not good for perspective-based 3D games or doing like looping ambience in them. And it's also not good for avoiding noticeable spatialization issues as you walk around them in the world. This method has the sounds essentially snap and teleport a little bit, which you don't notice that in 2D very much, but in 3D, when it's right beside you, it's the most noticeable thing in the world. So as far as sound design considerations for clustering in general, there's two kinds of sounds that seem to work really well. And I think I've sort of said this already. You've either got continuous or looping sounds, kind of like ongoing ambience or an ongoing sound from an object or group of objects. Or you've got short impact sounds that you're going to group together and treat those as like a combined version of all of those. So the continuous sounds work really well. They're really good for like that directional directional spatialization. So as you walk beside them, you'll be, oh, there's like, it's right there and you can hear it behind you and things like that. They also benefit really well from having additional custom sound parameters so you can discern that like this group of things has some different behavior, especially when it's some player observable or player influenceable behavior. Like if you can see the trees swaying in the wind, for instance, or if you can chase some cows, which we'll do soon. For impact sounds, I'm going to go a bit light on this, even though there's a lot of text. Basically, these are short-lived sounds. We're really just trying to say there were 100 collisions here. Can we play one sound instead? The challenge here is that you've got to write this system almost bespoke to handle what kind of collisions and what things are happening in your game. It doesn't work well with sounds that have got really short attack and sustain, because often you've got a choice of either delaying the sound by 1 frame in order to catch all of these events as they came in, or you have to essentially change the parameters while it's going, and then you could already be like 3/4 of the way through the sound before you find out that there are additional collisions that you're supposed to be grouping into it. So slightly different, but like if you go and try to make one of those, it'll be pretty clear like how to approach those. So I'm going to just jump into the method. This is going to be a bit of a complicated part, but like remember, this is like a high level. You can refer to all this later. But before we actually go through the steps, we need to sort of define some terms because this could be confusing. So a cluster type is kind of a definition, a schema for like, this is a kind of sound that can be clustered, and this is the settings for how it's clustered and everything. Everything about that clustering process goes into the cluster type. A point is one of those records. It's a position, or like this is where a collision occurred, or this is where where something is, and any parameters it might have. So like if it's a tree, it might have how much wind it's currently got, or if it's an object, what speed it's going. And then we have sources, and sources are anything in the game that provide points, and they need to provide also a bounding box or bounding volume that all the points are inside, because later on we're going to be doing culling with these. Finally, well, not finally, but clusters are dynamically created sound emitters. So whenever you hear a sound from any of these objects, it's coming from a cluster. They could be a cluster of 1 point or hundreds. Points can only be assigned to a single cluster at a time. So, and the cluster will always live at the average position of all of its points. Then there's the capture radius. Those circles you saw in the vessel video, they are the maximum distance that a sound is allowed to be from its cluster center. So, sorry, not the sound, a point is allowed to be. So if you have a point that is further than that from the center of a cluster, it's no longer allowed to be part of that cluster. Or if you're trying to add points to a cluster, they must be within that circle or they're not allowed to be. A couple other definitions. When I talk about spatialization in this talk, there's a lot of, like, spatialization is a huge field. There's like ray tracing, there's transport, there's all these things. I'm just talking about binaural directionality, which is like, if you have headphones on, you can tell what direction it is it in front of you, is it behind you? It's not just stereo pan. You can do all that other stuff with this, but it's kind of outside the scope of the talk. There's some considerations. When I say listener, I'm talking about the position and rotation of essentially the perspective that we're listening from, where we sampled the direction of a sound. It's usually the camera. So this is the thing where if the sound is to the left of this, you hear it to the left or to the right. Then we have the attenuation origin. Now, if you've only used Unity, you won't know that you can split these apart. In third-person games, we generally, first-person games, we'll keep the attenuation origin at the same position as the camera. This is basically where the distance fade of a sound is relative to. If we're doing a third-person game like Mario Odyssey, we don't want the volume to drop when the camera's zoomed all the way out. We want to base, hear what's around the player character. So we do distance fall off relative to them. The problem with this is that everyone's got a different name for it. Wise calls it a distance probe, Unreal calls it an attenuation override, and Unity doesn't do it at all. So I'm just calling it the attenuation origin. You can add it in Unity yourself, it's relatively easy, but they just don't provide it. All right, so basically in this method, the world space clustering, we're going to use a capture radius that is relative to the number of points in a cluster. So the more points you have in a cluster, that bigger that radius gets. If you lose points, it shrinks. There is a minimum cluster radius so that we don't just end up with single point clusters because they're all too small. And there's also a maximum so that we don't get a runaway effect and just end up with one giant blob cluster in the center of the level. And so here we go. The step-by-step, actually I do it over here so it's easier for me to see. First of all, one important rule, whenever we update the capture radius, so whenever we update a cluster's position, so different version. Whenever we update, add or remove points from a cluster, its position and cluster radius are modified instantly. This is because those clusters need to be at the correct position for the next step. We might be adding a whole lot of points, and if we're adding those points to clusters, we can only add them if all the clusters are in the correct locations. So the process goes like this. We first of all collect points from the game. So we go through our source objects and pull out any points that have changed. You want to have the system hold on to all copies of the old data, so it knows where all the points used to be and knows what's changed and where. Then we go through and we reposition any clusters that were affected by those points. So if any of those points moved, then we essentially re-average the positions for those clusters. Then we check for if any of the points have moved outside of their clusters. So once again, only the points that have moved, check if they're no longer inside their current cluster. If that happens, you take them out of their cluster. They essentially join any new points that you've added, that being points that don't have any cluster. The next step is that we assign any points that don't have a cluster to one that exists if possible. And if that fails, we try to create a new one for them to be added to. This is the step which creates clusters. So you will always start off by having points and no clusters. And then those points will essentially create a cluster, and hopefully you won't create too many at once. They'll sort of join an existing one as you go. One problem we'll run into is that we'll often end up with overlapping clusters, one cluster will be moving because its points moved from the last frame and now it's completely inside another one. So at this point, we'd actually just go and merge clusters by saying if a cluster has moved, or changed its radius, check if it's either fully encompassing any other clusters or check if any other clusters are fully encompassing it. And by that I mean, are they completely able to grab all of this cluster's points? If so, you let the larger cluster steal all the points and leave this cluster with no points. The idea is this is how we prepare to destroy any clusters that essentially have been overlapped by another one. Because in the next point, we'll basically start fading out the sounds for any clusters that have no points. If you get to this step in a cluster, it's got no points and it's also stopped its sound or completely faded out, that's when the cluster is actually destroyed. And then finally, for all the surviving clusters, any of these that have changed, we then go and update the audio engine, say, this is where this cluster's position is, and this is how many points it's got. And then you can also collect calculate any other data from your points to say, okay, well, this is the current density of the water or something like that. So this is a slide doing that in a lot more detail. This is a reference thing, so I'm not covering it in the talk, but be aware it's there. So let's jump to now. And my slide thing at the bottom of the screen is I left this running, so that red line's in the wrong position. So moving along to perspective clustering. Now, sorry, getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to do a very quick demo of this before we get started so that you've got something to refer to with this. So, the idea behind perspective clustering is that we need to be able to work in a 3D world. If all the clusters are in world space, we run into this problem that to have any sounds far away from us, we would need so many clusters. Like, if the maximum cluster size is 3 meters, how are you going to have a forest? So instead, we do it based off angles. Essentially, these spheres you're seeing here are essentially, that's your capture radius, and the lines represent points that have been assigned to each cluster. And the idea that we want is essentially to be able to move these things around, split them apart if necessary, and have it not be noticeable. There's a lot of factors into this, but the biggest one is that the cluster is actually size based on distance. So the further it gets away from us, the bigger it is, because the less noticeable it is at further distance that we're merging more sounds together. So, what's this actually good for? Well, 3D games. It can do 3D games with sounds in the distance. It's also good for automatic and seamless transition between very near ambience and very far ambience. Forests in the distance can be represented by a single sound source, but then you could be getting individual trees when you get up close. It's also really cool when you hook it up to a particle system because you can have the entire particle system playing a combined sound. The bad parts, it's a bit more computationally expensive than world space clustering. There's a couple more steps. It's not massively so. The big one is implementation time and complexity. There are a couple more steps involved in this, lot more edge cases, and writing one of these things takes a while. It took me, like, I can make a world space clustering system for a specific problem in an afternoon, and this will take me a week, maybe a bit more, to do, if I know exactly what we're doing. So like I was mentioning before, this work, the only main difference between this approach and the other one is that the capture radius is no longer based on just simple proximity. It's based off on how close, like how far can we stretch a sound to being in a cluster? How far can it be away before the player is going to notice? And we only really have good control over directionality and attenuation, so that's the two factors we're going to care about. We just don't want the angle between the sound, like from a particular point that's playing a sound and the cluster that's playing the sound for it, to be too far apart from our perspective. So that's going to be a smaller distance when it's close to me. It's going to be a very large one further away. And it's very easy to configure these using angles because of that. So you can basically say, okay, this angle this sound I'll notice if it's off by 45 degrees or 20 degrees. And then the same rule can also be used for attenuation because we're going to use that distance as the capture radius. So it's also going to be the distance that the sound could be in front or behind this, like the cluster origin and the cluster, and still belong to it. So, like as an example, so all of these trees are one cluster, and as I walk closer and closer, they all get split apart. Now, there's no interpolation in this version yet, but like when I bring the camera in, you notice that like it really shrunk them all down, and then as I walk away, it re-merges them back together because as those clusters grow, they're overlapping each other fully, so they merge, and it's a winner-take-all scenario. You end up with one cluster. So, I just maximized it. So, bit of maths, I'm sorry. So basically this turns out to just be distance times a constant number. Like I said, we're basing this off angles, and so the distance is literally just the sine of that angle times the minimum distance from either the listener to the sound or the attenuation origin to the sound. If you split them apart, the minimum of the two. Or if you have multiple listeners, you also just use the minimum distance to any of them. And you don't need to calculate sine every single time. You can just say that as a constant because like each setting is just like one multiplier, and we're just using angles because they're really easy for us to intuitively understand. So I use this for like not just the capture radius, but lots of settings. If you look in the demo, you'll find tons of them. There is one tweak to this I recommend. It's really noticeable if the direction, if you were to walk the listener or the camera through a cluster, you get to a point where one of the points would be on the left of you and the cluster would be on the right. You'd notice that instantly, like the sound is coming from the wrong place. If the attenuation origin does this, it's just going to get a little bit louder or a little bit quieter than it should be. You're not really going to notice. You're actually going to notice a whole lot less than how much the sound changes when we go splitting or merging clusters. So it's a really good idea to just clamp the minimum distance to the attenuation origin when you're doing this. And this basically means that when the attenuation origin gets too close to a cluster, it doesn't shrink to 0, it shrinks to a minimum size. Because below that size, you're not getting any benefit, you're actually just making everything harder. Again, like I could go answer more of the stuff at the end if anyone's curious, but really helpful. So now we're going to get into the method, and there's only a couple changes. Really, the only real change is this capture radius. But there's a bunch of other systems, or steps or systems that we need to put into place to handle all the edge cases that creates. So first of all, at the top, that first step is different. It is no longer just based off the number of points. It is now based off, you need to update the cluster's capture radius whenever points have changed or the listener or attenuation position has changed. Well, attenuation origin. This is basically because the cluster radius is now going to change when the listener moves closer or the attenuation origin moves closer, or it might, whichever, when the minimum one gets closer or further away, it's going to change. It could have a complete change on which points belong to each cluster because these things change. We're also working in 3D now, so we need to cull any points that are outside of the area because in a 3D world, it's so much easier to have way more stuff. So I'm going to add in an extra step. After collecting the points, we cull any that are too far away. We then continue on unchanged until after merging, we're going to need to interpolate the results. It's like in 2D, you're not going to notice that the sounds teleport around a bit. In 3D, you really will, especially when they're close to you. You also will really notice if the sound parameters like jump in values too. So we're going to use a method that lets us essentially interpolate anything in the cluster quite easily. Then finally, we use the interpolation values that we've calculated instead of a normal fade out. So when we're destroying the clusters, we will actually use, it's only when they're interpolated to completely 0 weight, which basically means no points, that's when we're going to destroy clusters. But and the interpolation actually runs that process for us. So this is literally if the clusters have no weight anymore, they get destroyed. And then finally, we do the same thing. We do the refresh step, but in this version, the position of the cluster is now the weighted average of the points and using the weights that we calculate during the interpolation step. So let's go into how those work as separate sections because each of those is kind of a whole thing. And then we're also going to briefly look at how we can support custom audio parameters. So the first part is that interpolation step. I know that the culling one comes first, but I kind of need to explain this one first. As I mentioned before, like sudden changes are super noticeable. So we basically need to avoid ever having clusters teleport around if their points change. So the way we do this, the way I originally did this was I just tried to interpolate the cluster's position from one place to another and each of the sound parameters. There are so many horrible edge cases with that. I'm not going to go into them all. All I can say is don't do that. This method works way better. So I'll show you what it looks like before I get into it. So this is exactly the same as the video before, but with interpolation. And you'll see the lines essentially moving, like going black, almost like progress bars as each one pulls back. And the numbers now will have floating point values on them. Those numbers are the total weight of each cluster, which essentially, once fully blended, is the number of points. And just running around the side for emphasis. So, the reason it's called point weight-based interpolation is the interpolation is done per point. Each point essentially has 100% weight, or like 1.0 worth of weight that it can have distributed between any of the clusters that exist. The point wants to have all of its weight assigned to the cluster it currently belongs to. So it will every single frame just linearly add its weight to that cluster, and because it's only got 1.0 worth of weight, it's going to reduce all other weights accordingly so that they have the remainder of whatever it isn't assigned. One thing that's really nice is that when we're culling the points, we can do exactly the same. We just we reduce all of the other points as if we were doing that, blending to a cluster that doesn't exist. And when they reach 0, we remove those weights, and then the points, that step comes through and says this cluster has no points and no weight, so the cluster gets destroyed. So the way this works is that every single cluster knows a list of all the points that have weights for it and what those weights are. And these are used for just about everything we send to the audio engine. The cluster itself does not move, just the audio emitter location. So the cluster will teleport to the new location, but its audio emitter will be the weighted average of these points. So rather than just add up all of the points, divide by the number of points to get the position, you add them up, multiplied by the weight of each of the points, and also then divide the result by the total weight. And the result is that if a point only has 0.1, 10% weight, it's only going to push your current cluster a tiny bit, and it's going to do more and more so as that value gets higher. So that's how the interpolation happens. Because it's happening from so many at the same time, it has a really nice smooth effect as multiple points start and end their own blends. It also has some really nice side effects. We can use the total weight from all of the weight points of our cluster instead of our previous integer-based number of points when we send that to the audio engine. It can just be interpolated by our game the way that it will be, and that prevents the interpolation from being delayed or out of sync in any way because it's matching the exact rate that the game is doing it. And you can also use that weighted average on audio parameters. So say you've got a custom audio parameters that is the speed of a cow that you're currently chasing, and you've got clustered with several other cows. You can take the weighted average of their speed and you add them all up, multiply each one by their own weight, and then divide that by the total weight, and that gives you a value which is the average, accommodating for any blending that's going on. So makes it really simple and also simplifies culling. So culling's pretty simple. There's no point in us doing any processing on the points for sounds that are outside the maximum audible distance of the sound. There's also another thing that we want to do, which is if we are running out of voices, we essentially have a maximum number of clusters for any sound, because we don't want to go over a limited number of voices, but also we really don't want to get into that situation where we're playing too many instances and we're getting destructive interference, using too many resources. So we're going to add a little bit extra, but the first part is just, we want to make sure that when I'm too far away from something, that sphere that's on the edge of the screen there, that's the culling radius. And as we move in, we can see all of these points becoming active. The interpolation handles them, clusters being assigned, destroyed, merged. And as we walk away, they get cleaned up as we walk away. Notice that they don't get destroyed instantly. They are all blended out using the interpolation. The really important reason for that is because even though a point might have left our maximum audible radius, the cluster probably hasn't. And if you removed any points instantaneously, the cluster would teleport its location. So In order to cull points, we basically don't want to go and check the distance to every single point. We're going to sometimes be dealing with truly absurd numbers of points with this system. Like you could have a particle system that you feed into this thing. So instead, what we do is we cull by the source objects first. If you remember from very early on in the slides at the start, I said that source objects all provide us with a bounding box that all of their points are going to belong inside. Like each source is could provide us with just one point, or it could provide us with a whole particle system worth. It could be hundreds or thousands. I have tested an incarnation of this system with over 1 million points and ran it at 30 frames per second on this laptop, which is 8 years old. So it's doable. But when you're culling, so what you do is you essentially go through and say, is that bounding box completely outside of our culling distance? If it is, that's all those points gone. They all need to be culled, and you don't need to check them individually. If it's fully inside the culling distance, so the outermost point of the box is still inside your capture radius, so not capture, your culling radius, then you include all those points. And then only if the bounding box is overlapping the culling radius, so part of it's outside, part of it's inside, then you need to check points individually. One other thing that I failed to mention here is that we do culling not relative to the listener, but the attenuation origin. This is because it's so closely aligned to the distance fall off of a sound. We normally will base the culling distance off whatever the maximum attenuation distance of a sound. So what's the distance at which this sound is completely silent? That's normally your starting point for our clusters, like for this culling distance. As I mentioned before, interpolating really helps this. So we don't do any processing. Culled points skip almost all the steps in the update, but they don't skip the the interpolation step. So they still blend their weights between clusters. The reason they do this is because we're essentially not going to truly cull them until they have no weight with any cluster. And once they're in this state, they're going to want to just zero out all their weights. That's what they'll be doing. Also, we don't delete the points when they're culled. They just get archived so that when we run back in range of them, we don't need to collect that point from the source again. It's just there ready for us. And then we get onto the next thing, which is the dynamic culling distance. So like I said, we're in the situation where we're not going to always have enough clusters or voices to represent the number of sounds that we want. If I bring the camera super in close amongst a whole thing of trees, and I've only got 5 clusters or 5 voices that I can use to play, I want to have those voices used for things near me, the ones that are loudest, the ones that are most relevant. And so the trick for this, we could sort them and do all kinds of complex stuff, or we could just bring the culling radius in to be much smaller until it's stable at that range. And so that's what we do. We basically just wait until we get into a situation where we have run out of clusters, and then we'll drop the culling radius to a position where we know we'll have the right number. So as I bring the camera in, it's going to shrink all those clusters down, many of them just down to a single tree. And as I bring it out, I could probably handle a couple more. And when I walk away, sure, I can turn all of that in. I've got enough clusters for all those trees now. So this is so simple, it's on a single slide. When we go through the update, remember I said we will try to create a cluster if a point has no cluster and it's not inside and it can't join another. If the point can't join another cluster and it doesn't have a cluster, we create a new one for it, and that can fail. Well, if that does happen, at the end of the update, we do this. We will essentially say, okay, the culling radius has, we need to cull at least one cluster. So we will drop the culling radius just enough that we will drop the furthest cluster from us, or from the attenuation origin. And that ensures that we've destroyed at least one cluster. And then we will keep the cluster radius at that size until we have spare clusters. And so essentially, our current number of clusters is sufficiently below our max number of clusters. So, max clusters might, say we had 15 clusters total, we would, actually, I'll cut this short because I'm running a little bit short on time. Basically, one important note, you need to have at least 2 spare clusters to increase the cluster radius in a stable fashion. I can answer that in more detail later. It's a very long explanation. Just trust me, if you don't ever set that, set the number of clusters in order to do this at 1. And if basically when you have enough spare clusters, you just gradually increase the cluster radius until, the culling radius, until it is the default value again. And despite the simplicity, this method works really well because it plays really nicely with the interpolation. I'm going to talk really quickly about custom point data and audio parameters. So to get good results out of the system, as I said before, you really want to have not just the number of points as an audio parameter so that it changes the sound based off that, but also other things that the player can notice so that they hear differences in the sound. So in order to do this, you need to be able to support your point data having custom inputs, like custom point values on each point, and you also need to be able to have a custom cluster on the other end interpreting all those. And this how to implement that is a bit outside the scope of this talk. But basically what I've got here is an example of why you really need to do this. These cows would just be mooing and being static if I didn't send in a parameter for their speed and how upset they were. So as I chase them around, you can see that the speed value is relative to the average speed of those cows, and then the agitation is the value of how much I've agitated them. It goes up very quickly when I'm chasing after them, gradually drops back down, and having multiple values really makes that far more interesting and dynamic than if you just had static cow moo and just increase the number of things for the number of points. So again, outside of the scope of this talk, but I will provide some advice. In C# with Unity, I recommend abusing generics to do this, so you can pass just a custom point data structure through that's got a standard parameters. My GCAP 2022 talk contains a lot of the information on how to do this. Just be aware that if you look at the demo source code, this is not done particularly well. It does do that, but it's not done in a way that's ideal. I do not have enough time to fix that up. In Unreal, I recommend using instance structs for the custom data, but then having a single structure that is used for standard data. So the position, the ID of the point, within that source. And so you have one structure that's used by the system and then one that's just here's my stuff. I won't go into details of why, but I tried both approaches and the splitting them apart makes it much simpler to implement. I could do another live demo if people want, if we have time. There is also technical details that goes into system structure and optimizations you can use if people want me to go into that. So really it's a case, I sort of want to throw this to crowd, how do people want me to just sort of answer questions over a live demo at the moment, or do you want me to go into any of technical detail stuffs with the remaining time? As a show of hands maybe for demo and answering questions that way? All right, that's easy. Sorry, technical details. You can read them on the slides if you want them. Also, all right, I have got a question here. How effective is this technique either with distinctive audio, like speech over a group of loudspeakers? Okay, so the problem here is you're going to run into individual sounds being really noticeable as you cut and blend them. This is really good for crowd mumble, but not crowd individual voices, because you're going to be crossfading in and out. If you walk too close, you would actually be cutting off that sound and splitting it apart. And also using sounds to represent multiple things. So speech is a particularly hard one. And also footsteps for nearby characters, you want to make sure that you're not clustering those, because those have to be in time with the animation. It's really hard to sort of make that work otherwise. I'm going to hand this off so that anyone who wants... actually, one thing first. Before I run out of time, thanks for listening to the talk part of the talk. I also want to throw out some special thanks to Ella Van Dyke, who basically iterated on the system with me. So basically she provided the, hey, what happens if this happens? And I'm like, oh no, let's go back and rewrite it again. But no, like that's how we got from the world space clustering technique all the way to this and all of those steps. She also helped me with providing all the sounds for the demo. Also, Gameloft Brisbane is where I work, and it's actually a pretty cool place. We do ambitious projects. The people there are lovely. The culture is really nice. Like, this is not something I've said about many large studios, and I've been in the industry 20 years. So I personally am enjoying being there. We do have Jefferson Blinko, who is one of our HR people here at the event. So if that is something that interests you, his contact details are on the slide, but also he is at the event if you run into him. Yes, so on with the questions. Oh. I've also just got to keep checking this thing. Cool. So if we want to give the mic around as well, if anyone wants to use that. All right. Could you give me a hand with this? Because otherwise I'm going to have to run back and forth.
Hello. Thank you, Kiera. That was brilliant. I've used a spline-based system for example, an ocean sound, and you run into this issue where the player is on a position, and if they move one way, it snaps to the right. If they move slightly the other way, it snaps to the left. So yes. I'm just trying to, and I know this solves that. I just can't quite. I'm not I've used a workaround where when I create those edge cases, I just switch to mono, and I'm like, okay, deal with it. But can you just explain, just so I'm translating correctly?
Yeah, okay. So it's like common for river splines or edge of water boundaries that you'll have a spline, and then you have a sound emitter that sort of follows you along the closest point on that. The problem is that, like, as the closest point of that, if that thing has complex curves in it, the closest point can teleport, which is, again, really goddamn noticeable. So in this, what you do is you sample multiple points along the spline and turn them into points given into the clustering system. And then what it will do, like, you can do that as densely or as loosely as you want. And then this would essentially group those points together into a set of sounds around you. You would end up using more voices than if you just had a single emitter, but it would gracefully handle things like, as you move out into the water, it would actually sort of split them apart around you as the listener moved over that point, without you hearing sort of like an audio, like directional snap as it teleports. So yeah, it's a good use for it. It's a little bit more like using more voices than you would in the normal method, but like it gets away from that snapping problem really well.
Hi, I just wanted to see what kind of considerations you need to do in terms of, like, if you want to, say, replicate the Doppler effect, like if you have like an explosion in the distance and it takes a while for like a sound to sort of travel before it reaches a player, like how do you manage that?
So there's really, so the Doppler effect is, so sound, basically delayed sound is something that works perfectly fine with this already. I think mostly if we're talking about impact sounds, because most of the sounds which you normally will be clustering will either be an impact sound and you're kind of either using a world space clustering technique on that, or you can run that through this. It's the same process. You really just want to pass in audio parameters that, like, for the movement, so you get the pitch shifting from the Doppler effect. The rest of the sound, actually delaying the sound for impact sounds is actually a good thing. So if it's like it happens and you have to wait a couple of seconds, all you do is you might pass that into like Fmod or Wise or whatever your audio system is, and say, hey, this is this far away, start a delay. The delay is really good because then the game can actually have a bunch of events happen and it can cluster those together, and then you can basically keep that cluster from decaying. Like, you basically keep those points around long enough until the sound has hit the player. So the only thing you'd have to do is basically keep those contact points around long enough that the player gets to hear the sound, and then remove them. Oh, and we are out of time. So I'm perfectly happy to answer questions after this. Sorry that ran like 10,000 miles an hour. Yes. I can finally relax. First time in 3 weeks.